Welcome, friends. Tonight, we travel to a world where information didn't flow from glowing screens or endless notifications, but still had the power to overwhelm, mislead, or stir unrest. Imagine narrow alleys and candlelit chambers, crowded market stalls, and church pulpits echoing with words few dared to question. In the medieval world, knowledge was precious, rare, and sometimes dangerous. Books were chained to desks, secrets were whispered, not shared. News arrived on foot, in scrolls or songs, or through the sharp voice of a town crier. And yet, even without the internet, there was such a thing as too much. People found themselves drowning in rumors, struggling to understand sermons in Latin, caught between royal decrees and village gossip, superstition and science. From hand-copied manuscripts to embroidered stories in stained glass, information came cloaked in mystery and carried both weight and wonder. Tonight, you'll hear how the medieval world passed messages, filtered truth, and sometimes deliberately kept things hidden. You'll discover how they coped with confusion, guarded knowledge, and carved meaning from a noisy, uncertain world. These are the quiet, strange, deeply human stories behind medieval information, stories of control, chaos, and connection. So, settle in, take a slow breath. Let the flicker of torchlight guide us to a time where every message had consequence, and too much information meant something very different. This is what too much information was like in medieval times, and more. Welcome to the journey.
Oral tradition and memory, how stories shaped medieval knowledge. In the dim glow of hearth fires, long before the widespread whisper of ink on parchment, knowledge in the medieval world wasn't read, it was heard. It lived in the rhythm of spoken words, passed down from generation to generation, carried on the very breath of a community. Imagine a world where the vast tapestry of human understanding was woven not by silent scribes, but by storytellers, their voices the conduits of history, law, and wisdom. This was the profound reality of oral tradition, the bedrock of medieval information. For centuries, across the diverse landscapes of Europe, from the frost-kissed halls of Anglo-Saxon chieftains to the sun-drenched courtyards of provincial troubadours, memory was the ultimate library. Without printing presses, widespread literacy, or digital archives, societies depended on the remarkable human capacity to retain and transmit information through spoken narratives. These weren't simply tales for entertainment, they were intricate systems of knowledge transfer. Genealogies, which dictated lineage and power, were recited with meticulous precision. Legal precedents, crucial for resolving disputes and maintaining order, were enshrined in oral customs and remembered rulings. Practical skills, from the art of blacksmithing to the timing of harvests, were taught and reinforced through repetitive instruction and demonstration, accompanied by explanatory narratives. The power of oral tradition lay in its immediacy and accessibility. Everyone, regardless of their literacy, could partake in the communal pool of knowledge. Bards, scopas, and griots, in cultures where such figures existed, weren't merely entertainers. They were the living encyclopedias of their societies. They held the collective memory, preserving epic poems, historical accounts, and moral lessons through mnemonic devices. Rhyming schemes, alliterative verses, repetitive refrains, and formulaic phrases. These techniques weren't artistic flourishes, they were vital tools for recall, ensuring that complex narratives could be accurately reproduced across countless retellings. A skillful storyteller could hold an audience rapt for hours, weaving together threads of the past, present, and even imagined future, subtly embedding crucial information within compelling narratives. However, the very nature of oral tradition also held inherent limitations. Knowledge, though widely accessible, was also remarkably fluid. Each retelling, each performance could introduce subtle variations, conscious or unconscious. A forgotten detail, a misremembered name, or a slight alteration to a plot point could, over generations, shift the meaning or accuracy of the information. There was no fixed text to consult, no definitive version to refer back to. This fluidity meant that historical events could morph into legend, and practical advice might blend with superstitious belief. The boundaries between fact and folklore were often permeable, creating a rich but sometimes ambiguous landscape of understanding. Furthermore, the scale of knowledge transferable through oral means was inherently constrained by human memory and the capacity for personal interaction. Information could only travel as far as a person could walk, ride, or sail, and could only be retained for as long as it was actively remembered and retold. This created a highly localized knowledge base, with different regions often possessing distinct sets of historical narratives, legal customs, and practical wisdom. The concept of a universal body of knowledge, easily shared across vast distances, was simply beyond the reach of the medieval oral world. Despite these limitations, the ingenuity with which medieval people structured their oral traditions is a testament to human adaptability. They developed elaborate systems of apprenticeship, where practical skills were demonstrated and explained vocally, ensuring the continuation of crafts. They created complex legal customs that were passed down through generations of oral rulings and community consensus, reinforced by public pronouncements. Even religious dogma, before widespread written scriptures, relied heavily on sermons, chanted prayers, and sacred stories shared verbally within the church and community. The fading echoes of oral tradition gradually gave way to the rising prominence of the written word, particularly with the advent of monastic scriptoria. But even as manuscripts began to accumulate in quiet libraries, the deep-seated habits of oral learning and transmission persisted. Peasants still learned their agricultural lore from their elders, village disputes were still often settled by remembered custom, and news, for the vast majority, still traveled by word of mouth. The spoken word remained a powerful force, shaping not only what people knew, but also how they understood their world, connecting them to their ancestors and to each other through the shared act of listening and remembering. It was a quieter world, perhaps, but one where every story carried the weight of history and the very essence of human knowledge.
Monks and manuscripts, the sacred art of copying books. Step into the hushed confines of a medieval monastery, where shafts of weak light filter through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Here, in the scriptorium, the very heart of intellectual life for centuries, the sacred art of copying books unfolded. This wasn't merely transcription, it was a painstaking, reverent process that preserved the flickering flame of knowledge through the long, often tumultuous medieval period. The act of creating a manuscript was a profound act of devotion, both to God and to the written word. Imagine the daily life of a monastic scribe. Their day began before dawn, with prayers and religious services. After a meager meal, they would arrive at the scriptorium, a room often unheated and damp even in the depths of winter. Each scribe, seated at their carrel, a small individual workspace, would face a challenging array of tasks. The first step was preparing the parchment, or vellum, the treated animal skin that formed the pages. This was a laborious process. Skins had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped thin, and bleached, a task often undertaken by specialized lay workers or less experienced monks. The quality of the parchment was paramount, as it directly impacted the durability and appearance of the finished book. Next came the meticulous work of ruling the pages. Using a stylus and straight edge, scribes would precisely mark guidelines for text, margins, and the spaces for illuminations and capital letters.
This ensured uniformity and legibility, a crucial step before a single word was penned. The ink itself was a natural concoction, often made from gall nuts, iron salts, and gum arabic, producing a rich black that would endure for centuries. Red ink, used for titles and headings, hence the word rubrication from ruber for red, was derived from minimum or cinnabar. With materials prepared, the copying began. A master text or exemplar would be placed before the scribe. The work was slow, methodical, and incredibly demanding on the eyes and hands. Quill pens, made from goose or swan feathers, had to be constantly sharpened with a small knife, leaving tiny shavings that often litter medieval manuscript pages. The scribe's concentration had to be absolute. Even a single misplaced stroke could ruin a page, necessitating painstaking erasure or, worse, starting over. Each word was a step in a sacred journey, a direct connection to the knowledge of the past. The texts copied were incredibly diverse, though religious works always took precedence. Bibles, psalters, liturgical texts, and commentaries on Scripture formed the core output of most scriptoria. However, monks also painstakingly copied classical Latin texts, preserving the works of Virgil, Cicero, and Seneca, which might otherwise have been lost to history. Treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and law also found their way onto parchment, slowly building up the intellectual capital of the age. This act of preservation wasn't always driven by a love of secular knowledge. Often these classical texts were seen as useful for teaching Latin or understanding ancient thought through a Christian lens. Beyond the black and red text, many manuscripts were transformed into breathtaking works of art through illumination. This was the realm of specialized artists within the monastery, or sometimes lay artisans. Using vibrant pigments derived from ground minerals and plants, lapis lazuli for blue, malachite for green, gold leaf for shimmering accents, illuminators would adorn pages with intricate borders, miniature scenes, and ornate capital letters. These illuminations served not only as decoration, but also as visual aids, helping an often semi-literate audience grasp the content of the text and adding immense value to the manuscript. The meticulous detail and vibrant colors still mesmerize us today, centuries later. The scriptorium wasn't just a place of copying, it was a center of learning. Scribes often worked in silence, broken only by the scratching of quills and the rustle of parchment. Yet, through their work, they absorbed the content of the books they copied, deepening their own understanding. Some scribes might add marginal notes, correct errors, either their own or those in the exemplar, or even make minor editorial changes. This human element, while occasionally introducing inconsistencies, also reflects the active engagement of the scribe with the text. The sheer labor involved in producing a single manuscript was immense. A full Bible could take several monks to complete. The cost of materials, especially parchment and pigments, was astronomical, making each book an incredibly valuable commodity. Because of this, books were chained to reading desks in libraries or stored securely, only to be accessed by a privileged few. Monastic scriptoria, therefore, acted as the primary knowledge replication centers of the medieval world, safeguarding intellectual heritage during a period of upheaval and limited communication. They were the unsung heroes of information preservation, their quiet diligence ensuring that the words of the past could speak to future generations. Without their unwavering dedication, countless ancient texts and much of medieval thought would have vanished into the mists of time. The medieval library, Scrolls, codices, and access to knowledge. Imagine a place of quiet reverence, where the very air seems to hum with the accumulated wisdom of ages. This was the medieval library, not the grand, publicly accessible institutions we know today, but rather secluded havens of learning, often tucked away within monastic walls, cathedral chapters, or nascent university precincts. These were more than just storage rooms for books. They were the carefully guarded repositories of the written world, where scrolls and codices represented the ultimate treasures of knowledge, accessible only to a select few. The earliest medieval libraries, particularly during the early Middle Ages, would have housed a mix of formats. The scroll, inherited from antiquity, was still in use, particularly for shorter texts or records. Imagine a monastic scholar unrolling a long strip of parchment, carefully navigating its length to find a specific passage. This linear format, while functional, presented challenges for quick reference and systematic organization. However, as the centuries progressed, the codex, a book made of folded and bound pages, much like our modern books, gradually became the dominant form. The shift to the codex was revolutionary for information access. It allowed for easier browse, quick page flipping, and the ability to add indexes or tables of contents, making knowledge far more navigable. What did these medieval libraries look like? Forget towering shelves and vast reading rooms. Many early monastic libraries were simply secure chests or armoires in a cloister or sacristy, protecting their precious contents from damp, pests, and theft. As collections grew, dedicated rooms emerged, often on the upper floors to minimize humidity. Books might be stored flat, or increasingly, on sloping desks. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of many medieval libraries was the chained book. To prevent theft and ensure books remained within the confines of the library, valuable manuscripts were literally chained to reading desks. Imagine the clink of metal as a scholar pulled a heavy tome closer, the chain allowing just enough slack for reading. This practice vividly underscores the immense value and scarcity of each volume. The kinds of books held within these sacred spaces were overwhelmingly religious texts. Bibles, liturgical books, missals, breviaries, commentaries on scripture, and the writings of church fathers like Augustine and Jerome formed the core collection. These were essential for daily monastic life, theological study, and the propagation of Christian doctrine. However, medieval libraries weren't solely devoted to theology. They also contained invaluable copies of classical Latin authors, poets, philosophers, historians, whose works had survived the collapse of the Roman Empire thanks to the painstaking efforts of earlier scribes. These texts, though sometimes viewed with suspicion by strict religious authorities, were crucial for understanding grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. As universities began to emerge in the High Middle Ages, places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, their libraries focused more heavily on legal texts, medical treatises, and philosophical works, reflecting their specialized curricula. Imagine a student poring over a manuscript of Aristotle, perhaps with extensive marginal commentaries added by previous scholars, a testament to centuries of intellectual engagement. So, who had the privilege to access these literary treasures? Primarily monks, clergy, and university scholars. For the average peasant, or even a prosperous merchant, written knowledge was largely out of reach. Monastic libraries served their own communities of monks and nuns, providing resources for prayer, study, and the copying of new texts. Cathedral libraries supported the local clergy and their educational endeavors. University libraries were dedicated to the masters and students, allowing them to consult the foundational texts of their disciplines. Access was a privilege, not a right. and was often granted based on one's position within the ecclesiastical or academic hierarchy. Borrowing books was a rare and highly regulated affair. If a book was allowed to leave the library, it would be recorded meticulously in a loan register, often with strict deadlines and penalties for damage or loss. The act of reading was a serious scholarly pursuit, not a casual pastime. Scholars would often read aloud, or at least mouth the words, as silent reading wasn't yet a common practice. The very act of engaging with a book was a multi-sensory experience, involving the sight of the script, the feel of the parchment, and the sound of the words. The medieval library, therefore, stands as a symbol of the immense value placed on written information in an age of scarcity. It was a testament to the dedication of those who copied, preserved, and sought to understand the knowledge contained within its pages. These quiet, often isolated sanctuaries were the custodians of civilization's memory, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of the past wouldn't be extinguished, but rather carefully nurtured until the dawn of a new era of information dissemination. They weren't places of too much information, but rather precious reservoirs where every single word held profound significance.
The role of scribes, gatekeepers of information. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the crisp, cool air of a medieval scriptorium, the faint scent of parchment and ink, and the rhythmic scratching of a quill against vellum. Here, illuminated by flickering candlelight or the pale light of a narrow window, sat the scribe, a figure both anonymous and profoundly influential, a true gatekeeper of information in an age where every written word was a precious commodity. Their lives, often tedious and solitary, were critical to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. Who were these scribes? They came from various walks of life, though most were monks or clergy. Within monastic communities, copying manuscripts was considered a pious and disciplined act, a form of active meditation and devotion. These monastic scribes worked for the glory of God and the enrichment of their order's library. Beyond the monasteries, there were also professional scribes in burgeoning towns and royal courts. These were lay individuals, often educated, who copied legal documents, royal decrees, private letters, and administrative records for a fee. Their work was driven by necessity and commerce, ensuring the wheels of governance and trade continued to turn. Their day-to-day existence was one of focused, intimate labor. A scribe would sit hunched over a sloped desk, often for hours on end, their fingers stained with ink. The act of copying wasn't merely mechanical. It demanded intense concentration and a deep understanding of the text. Imagine the strain on their eyes, meticulously tracing each letter, ensuring the spacing and alignment were perfect. The tools of their trade were simple but essential: a sharp quill pen, a pot of iron gall ink, a small knife to sharpen quills and scrape away errors, and a pumice stone to smooth the parchment. The very air would be filled with the subtle sounds of this meticulous work, the soft rustle of parchment, the rhythmic scratch of the quill, perhaps a quiet cough or the turning of a page. But the scribe's role extended far beyond mere transcription. They were active participants in shaping the information they copied. Firstly, they were responsible for fidelity to the exemplar, the source text. A good scribe strove for accuracy, meticulously reproducing every word, punctuation mark, and even abbreviation. Errors, however, were inevitable. A lapse in concentration could lead to an omitted line, a duplicated word, or a miscopied letter, creating what scholars call scribal errors. These errors would then be perpetuated in subsequent copies, like a ripple expanding across a pond of knowledge. Sometimes a scribe would consciously correct what they perceived as an error in their exemplar, or fill in a gap, subtly altering the text. More significantly, scribes often acted as agents of censorship or interpretation. Under the direction of their abbots, bishops, or patrons, a scribe might be instructed to omit certain passages deemed heretical or inappropriate. Conversely, they might expand upon sections, add marginal glosses, explanatory notes, or even insert their own commentary,
reflecting their personal beliefs or the prevailing theological viewpoints of their time. For instance, a scribe copying a classical pagan text might add Christian allegories to make it more palatable or safe for a monastic audience. This meant that the information a medieval person received was often filtered and shaped by the worldview of the person who copied it. Consider the sensory details of their work: the cool, smooth feel of the vellum under their fingertips, the earthy scent of the ink, the rhythmic scratch of the quill, or the focused light catching the tiny fibers of the parchment. This was a physical, almost meditative act. For monastic scribes, their work was a form of prayer, a means to contribute to the spiritual wealth of their community. For professional scribes, it was a skilled craft, demanding precision and a steady hand. The consequences of their work were immense. Without scribes, the vast majority of ancient knowledge would have been lost during the turbulent early Middle Ages. They preserved philosophical treatises, scientific observations, however rudimentary, legal codes, and historical narratives that form the very foundation of our understanding of past civilizations. They were the human bridge across centuries, carefully carrying the torch of learning from one generation to the next. In a world where books were rare and precious, each manuscript represented hundreds, if not thousands of hours of dedicated labor. The scribe, often an anonymous hand, was the unsung hero of this silent revolution. They didn't merely reproduce information, they actively mediated it. Their personal decisions, their occasional errors, and their diligent dedication influenced what survived, what was understood, and what was passed on. They were the quiet, pivotal gatekeepers who determined what too much information actually meant in medieval times. For them, it was never too much, but rather a constant, painstaking effort to ensure that any information, however small, was painstakingly brought into existence and then preserved.
Imagine trying to access the vast majority of scientific, philosophical, and religious texts today, only to find they're exclusively written in a language you don't understand. This was the linguistic reality for most people in the medieval world, where Latin stood as the imposing gatekeeper of knowledge, creating a significant barrier between the learned elite and the common folk who spoke myriad vernaculars. This linguistic divide profoundly shaped who had access to information and how that information flowed, or more often didn't flow, through society. For centuries, following the collapse of the Roman Empire, Latin remained the lingua franca of scholarship, administration, and the church across Western Europe. It was the language of the Bible, of theology, of law, of medicine, and of all serious intellectual discourse. If you wanted to study at a university, become a cleric, or engage with philosophical treatises, Latin wasn't merely an advantage, it was an absolute prerequisite. Scholars from different corners of Europe, speaking vastly different regional dialects in their daily lives, could communicate with each other through the shared medium of Latin, creating a pan-European intellectual community, albeit a small and exclusive one. This dominance meant that the most significant works of the age, and indeed the preserved wisdom of antiquity, were locked behind a linguistic wall. The writings of church fathers like Augustine, the philosophical works of Aristotle, as they became available through Arabic translations and then Latin versions, the legal codes of Justinian, and early scientific texts were all composed and copied in Latin. To engage with these texts meant mastering a complex language that was no longer anyone's native tongue, a language whose grammar and vocabulary required years of dedicated study. Meanwhile, outside the monasteries, universities, and royal courts, the vast majority of the population communicated in a bewildering array of vernacular languages. These were the everyday tongues of the common people: Old English, Old French, Old High German, various Romance dialects that would evolve into modern Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, and countless local patois. These languages were constantly evolving, often with significant regional variations that could make communication difficult even between villages a relatively short distance apart. For instance,
A peasant in Yorkshire might struggle to understand a merchant from Kent, let alone someone from Aquitaine. This linguistic chasm meant that for most medieval people, direct access to written information was simply impossible. They relied instead on oral transmission, sermons in their local church, pronouncements from the town criers, or stories and news shared through gossip. While some vernacular literature did emerge, particularly in the later Middle Ages, like the Chanson des Gestes in France or the sagas in Iceland, these were primarily for entertainment or to celebrate local heroes, not for the systematic transmission of complex knowledge. Even when a text was eventually translated into a vernacular, the process was slow and expensive, meaning only a tiny fraction of Latin knowledge ever reached a non-Latinate audience in written form. Consider the practical implications. A farmer could understand the spoken words of his priest during Mass, but the intricate theological arguments within the Latin Bible were utterly beyond his grasp. A commoner might hear about a new royal decree from the town crier, but the nuanced legal intricacies written in official Latin documents would remain a mystery. This created a profound power imbalance. Those who understood Latin held the keys to knowledge, authority, and often social advancement. The slow, gradual emergence of vernacular languages into written forms marks a significant, though protracted shift in the medieval information landscape. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly from the 12th century onwards, there was a growing demand for texts in the common tongue. This was driven by a rising merchant class, a nascent urban culture, and a desire for more direct engagement with religious texts among some lay people. Poets began to write in their native languages, romances became popular, and even some religious texts saw vernacular translations, although often with careful church oversight. For example, John Wycliffe's efforts to translate the Bible into English in the late 13th century were met with fierce opposition from the church, precisely because it threatened the clergy's exclusive role as interpreters of sacred text. This illustrates the deep-seated resistance to widespread vernacular literacy and the accompanying democratization of knowledge. Ultimately, the linguistic barrier imposed by Latin was one of the most defining characteristics of medieval information flow. It created an intellectual elite and confined the vast majority of complex written knowledge to a rarefied few. The slow, arduous journey from a Latin-dominated world to one where vernaculars gained prominence laid the groundwork for future information revolutions. But for centuries, understanding too much information meant little more than understanding the language in which it was written. The common person, standing outside the gates of Latin, largely remained in the realm of oral tradition, their knowledge shaped by the sounds of their own tongue rather than the silent words of the scribes.
Town criers and public announcements, voices of the streets. Imagine the bustling heart of a medieval town, the clamor of the market, the distant clang of the blacksmith, the murmur of countless conversations. Then, cutting through the cacophony, a sudden, distinctive sound rings out. The sharp, insistent peal of a bell. Heads turn, conversations quiet. For a moment, all eyes are drawn to a figure standing purposefully in the midst of the square, the town crier. In a world largely unburdened by written news, this individual was the original human broadcast system, the vital voice of the streets, ensuring that public information reached every ear. The town crier, or bellman, was an indispensable part of medieval urban life. Often dressed in a distinctive livery, perhaps a uniform or special badge, they were easily recognizable. Their primary tool was their voice, trained to project and carry across the din of the marketplace, and their trusty bell, a universal signal to command attention. Before announcing any news, the crier would ring their bell vigorously, often accompanied by the traditional cry of "Oyez, oyez, oyez," which served as an immediate summons for the populace to listen. What kind of information did these vocal purveyors of news disseminate? Almost everything of public relevance. Royal decrees and proclamations from the king or local lord were paramount, informing the populace of new laws, taxes, or military conscriptions. Imagine the solemn tone as a crier announced a new levy on grain, or the urgency in their voice as they called for able-bodied men to join a military campaign. Local ordinances were also common, regulations about market hygiene, curfews, or measures to prevent fire. They might declare a public holiday, announce the arrival of visiting dignitaries, or summon citizens for jury duty. Public events such as fairs, festivals, tournaments, or even public executions were all announced with appropriate solemnity or fanfare. Imagine the buzz of excitement rippling through the crowd as a crier proclaimed an upcoming jousting tournament, or the hushed reverence as they announced a significant religious procession. The impact of the town crier was profound in a society where literacy rates were incredibly low. For the vast majority of the population, peasants, laborers, even many merchants, written documents were inaccessible. The crier bypassed this barrier entirely, bringing essential information directly to the ears of the people. This made them powerful figures, shaping public opinion and understanding of events. Their tone, their emphasis, and even their personal demeanor could subtly influence how a message was received. A grim tone for a new tax, or an enthusiastic voice for a royal wedding would color the public's reaction. The method of dissemination was highly effective for local news. The crier would walk a predetermined route through the town, stopping at key intersections or busy squares, repeating their announcements several times to ensure it reached as many people as possible. This was a direct, personal form of communication, fostering a sense of communal awareness. People relied on the crier as their primary source of official news, complementing the informal networks of gossip and rumor that also flowed through the streets. However, the crier's reach was inherently limited by geography. They could only broadcast within the confines of their town or immediate surrounding area. News from distant cities or foreign lands would arrive slowly, if at all, carried by travelers or official messengers before being eventually put into the crier's voice. This meant that the information landscape was highly localized, and immediate reactions to distant events were impossible. Despite these limitations, the town crier stands as a vibrant symbol of medieval information exchange. They were the original broadcasters, their voices echoing the pulse of the community. They embodied the era's reliance on oral transmission, a direct and unfiltered connection between authority and populace. The sound of their bell, signaling the arrival of news, would have been a familiar and often anticipated part of daily life. It reminds us that even in a world devoid of screens and instant notifications, the human need to be informed, to understand the world around them, was as strong then as it is now, relying on the resonant voices of the streets to keep the current flowing.
In the medieval world, the concept of rapid communication was entirely foreign. There were no wires, no air travel, no instant digital messages. Instead, the lifeline of information across distances was woven through the arduous journeys of messengers and the precious cargo they carried, letters. This was the medieval postal system, a slow, perilous, but utterly vital network that connected kingdoms, families, and fortunes, shaping the flow of news and decisions across vast, often dangerous landscapes. Imagine the journey of a medieval letter. It began with the act of writing, often by a scribe for a noble or merchant, perhaps by a monk for an abbot, or even by a rare literate individual for a family member. The letter would be carefully composed, its contents reflecting matters of state, commerce, or personal affairs. Once written, it wasn't simply folded and put into an envelope like today. Instead, it was often folded and sealed with wax, bearing the unique impression of a signet ring or a personal seal. This seal wasn't just a mark of authenticity, it was a security measure,
indicating that the letter had not been tampered with and was indeed from the purported sender. The intactness of the seal was paramount upon delivery. Then came the messenger. These individuals were the unsung heroes of medieval communication. They varied greatly. A royal courier might be a skilled horseman, riding alone or with a small guard, carrying dispatches of urgent national importance. Monasteries might use their own monks traveling between sister houses. Merchants employed their agents or hired individuals to carry bills of lading, contracts, and market information. Private citizens, if they sent letters at all, often relied on travelers, pilgrims, or other acquaintances heading in the right direction. The system was highly informal and often reliant on personal trust and existing networks. The journey itself was fraught with challenges. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, poorly maintained and infested with bandits. Swollen rivers, dense forests, and treacherous mountain passes presented natural obstacles. Weather could turn a swift journey into a week-long ordeal or halt it altogether. A messenger might face hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of ambush. Imagine a lone rider cloaked against the driving rain, their hand instinctively resting on the hilt of their dagger, constantly scanning the tree line for danger. The average speed of travel was slow by modern standards, often no more than 20 to 30 miles a day for a mounted messenger, and significantly less for those on foot. This inherent slowness meant that news traveled agonizingly slowly. A major battle fought in one part of the kingdom might take weeks to reach the royal court in another. An important decree might take months to disseminate across an entire realm. The concept of breaking news simply didn't exist in the medieval sense. Decisions had to be made based on old information or on assumptions about what was happening elsewhere. This created a strategic challenge for rulers and a source of constant anxiety for families separated by distance. For instance, the outcome of a significant siege might not be known for a month or more in distant parts of the kingdom, during which time rumors would undoubtedly fill the void. A merchant awaiting news of a ship's arrival from a foreign port could be waiting for months, completely reliant on the safe passage of a single letter or manifest. This delay profoundly impacted trade, diplomacy, and military operations. Despite these inefficiencies, the messenger system was remarkably effective for its time. Relay points, where fresh horses could be obtained or messages transferred, did exist in more organized systems, such as those established by religious orders or powerful monarchs. However, there was no comprehensive, standardized public postal service akin to those developed in later centuries. It was largely a patchwork of ad hoc arrangements, personal services, and specialized networks. The arrival of a messenger was often a significant event, particularly in isolated communities or at royal courts. Imagine the relief and anticipation as a travel-worn figure dismounted, bearing sealed dispatches. The news they carried, whether good or ill, would dramatically shift the atmosphere and could trigger immediate action. Ultimately, the medieval system of messengers and letters was a testament to human ingenuity in overcoming geographical barriers with limited technology. It highlights the profound value placed on written communication, despite its slow pace and inherent risks. This was an age where too much information was never the problem. Rather, it was the chronic scarcity, the agonizing delay, and the precarious journey of every single piece of intelligence that defined the information landscape. Each letter, each messenger, was a precious link in the fragile chain of knowledge that spanned the medieval world.
Heraldry and symbols, visual language of identity. In the vibrant pageantry of the medieval world, where literacy was a privilege of the few, information often spoke loudest through visual language. Among the most powerful and pervasive of these symbolic systems was heraldry. Imagine a knight charging into battle, his shield emblazoned with a striking pattern, a royal banner fluttering over a castle, or a wax seal pressed onto a vital document.
These weren't mere decorations. They were sophisticated forms of communication, conveying complex information about lineage, allegiance, and social status with a glance. At its core, heraldry was a system of hereditary devices, primarily coats of arms, used to identify individuals, families, and institutions. Its origins lie in the 12th century, emerging from the practical necessity of distinguishing armored knights on the battlefield and in tournaments, where faces were obscured by helmets. A knight's shield, helmet, and surcoat became canvases for their unique designs, allowing allies and enemies alike to quickly ascertain their identity and allegiance in the chaos of combat. The visual grammar of heraldry was precise and rule-bound, a complex system known as blazon. Each element of a coat of arms, its colors, tinctures, its shapes, ordinaries, and its depicted objects, charges, carried specific meanings and followed strict conventions. For example, tinctures were limited to metals, gold, ore, silver, argent, and colors, red, gules, blue, azure, black, sable, green, vert, purple, purpure. The placement and combination of these elements created a unique visual identity. A lion rampant might symbolize courage, a fleur-de-lis, purity or royal connection, and a chevron might represent protection. The very act of reading a coat of arms was akin to deciphering a complex yet universally understood visual code. This visual shorthand was incredibly efficient in an era of widespread illiteracy. A peasant might not be able to read a written decree, but they could instantly recognize the royal arms of their king on a banner, understanding who held authority. A merchant traveling through unfamiliar territory could identify the lord of a castle by his heraldic device, knowing whether they were entering friendly or hostile lands. Heraldry became a fundamental aspect of public life, gracing not only shields and banners, but also seals on documents, stained glass windows, carvings on buildings, and even tomb effigies. Beyond simple identification, heraldry communicated nuanced social and political information. Lineage was paramount. A coat of arms was passed down through generations, often with additions or modifications to denote marriages, alliances, or differences within a family. Cadency. A quartered shield might display the arms of multiple ancestral families, signifying a complex inheritance of titles and lands. This visual record served as a powerful historical narrative, telling the story of a family's rise, its alliances, and its prestigious connections over centuries. Allegiance was also clearly broadcast. Vassals would often incorporate elements of their lord's arms into their own, or display their lord's banner alongside their own, signaling their loyalty. In times of war, identifying friend from foe relied heavily on recognizing banners and shield devices. The sight of an enemy's heraldry on the horizon would immediately convey a threat, while the familiar arms of an ally would bring relief. Moreover, heraldry conveyed social status. The complexity and richness of a coat of arms, the number of quarterings, and the addition of supporters, animals or figures flanking the shield, or crests worn atop the helmet, often indicated a higher social standing or significant achievement. While simpler arms might belong to lesser nobility, a king's arms would be exceptionally grand and instantly recognizable across his realm. The creation and regulation of heraldry eventually became a formalized profession, with heralds acting as experts. Heralds were not just designers, they were official messengers, negotiators, and keepers of genealogical records. They proclaimed tournaments, oversaw ceremonies, and maintained registers of arms, ensuring proper usage and resolving disputes over armorial rights. Their existence underscores the importance of heraldry as a structured information system, vital for maintaining order and identity within the nobility. In a world where abstract concepts like nation or state were often embodied by the person of the monarch, their personal arms served as a tangible symbol of power and authority.
The visual language of heraldry was pervasive, a constant reminder of hierarchy, loyalty, and tradition. It was a sophisticated method for a largely non-literate society to communicate complex social structures and historical narratives instantaneously without needing a single written word.
Church and censorship, controlling the message. In the medieval world, one institution wielded unparalleled authority over the minds and souls of the populace: the Church. Its reach extended far beyond spiritual guidance, permeating every aspect of life, from law and education to art and, crucially, information. For centuries, the Church acted as the ultimate gatekeeper of knowledge, deciding what was permissible to know, what was deemed dangerous, and how the message of God and the world should be understood. This profound influence often manifested as censorship, shaping medieval thought in ways that are hard for us to fully grasp today. The Church's motivation for controlling information stemmed from a deep-seated belief in its divine mission to safeguard the purity of Christian doctrine and ensure the salvation of souls. In an age of widespread illiteracy, the clergy were the primary interpreters of sacred texts and the conduit for divine knowledge. The Bible, in its original Latin, was largely inaccessible to the common person, making them entirely dependent on their priests and bishops for understanding. This position afforded the Church immense power to control the narrative. The most direct form of censorship was the suppression of heretical texts. Any writing that challenged orthodox Christian dogma, questioned the authority of the Pope, or promoted alternative interpretations of Scripture was swiftly condemned. Works by figures deemed heretical, like the Cathars or Waldensians, were systematically sought out and destroyed. Imagine monks scouring scriptoriums for forbidden books, or inquisitors seizing manuscripts from suspected dissenters. These books were often publicly burned, a stark warning to anyone who dared to challenge established beliefs. Beyond outright heresy, the Church also exercised control over other forms of knowledge. Classical pagan texts, though often preserved by monks for their linguistic value, were frequently viewed with suspicion. Scribes might subtly alter passages, add Christian allegories, or preface them with disclaimers to ensure their content was interpreted through a Christian lens. Scientific inquiry, particularly astronomy and medicine, was tolerated as long as it didn't contradict theological tenets. For instance, theories about the cosmos that challenged the geocentric model, Earth as the center of the universe, or medical practices that relied on magic rather than established Galenic principles could draw the Church's ire. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, became a formidable instrument of this control. Its primary purpose was to identify and prosecute heresy, and a significant part of its work involved monitoring and censoring written materials. Suspect books could lead to the interrogation, torture, and even execution of their authors or owners. This created an atmosphere where intellectual inquiry often had to proceed cautiously, often cloaked in allegorical language or limited to private circles to avoid suspicion. Censorship wasn't just about outright suppression. It was also about shaping the narrative. Preachers meticulously crafted their sermons to convey approved doctrines and moral lessons. Art, particularly stained glass windows and frescoes, served as a powerful visual curriculum, depicting biblical stories and saints' lives in ways that reinforced church teachings. Even popular tales and songs were often imbued with Christian themes, subtly guiding the moral compass of society. The Church's pervasive influence meant that the information people received, whether through sermons, art, or the rare written text, was almost always filtered through a theological lens. The impact of this control was profound. It fostered a relatively unified worldview across Western Europe, where Christian doctrine provided the framework for understanding the universe, human nature, and morality. It also, however, stifled intellectual diversity and delayed the widespread acceptance of ideas that might challenge prevailing dogma. Critical thinking, while encouraged within certain scholastic debates, often had boundaries defined by theological orthodoxy. The late medieval period saw some subtle shifts. The rise of universities allowed for a greater, though still constrained, exchange of ideas. The growing demand for vernacular texts also presented new challenges to the Church's control, as more people sought to engage with religious material directly, outside of priestly interpretation. However, the legacy of church censorship cast a long shadow over the medieval information landscape, creating a world where too much information was rarely the concern. Rather, it was the careful management and often deliberate restriction of what could be known, seen, and believed, all in the name of spiritual purity and social order. The Church's authority over the message was absolute, shaping the very fabric of medieval thought for centuries.
Secrets and espionage, spies and hidden messages. In the turbulent and uncertain world of medieval power, where loyalties were fluid and rivalries often deadly, information was currency and secrets were power. Beneath the surface of grand tournaments and courtly etiquette, a shadowy realm of espionage thrived. Rulers, nobles, and even the church employed networks of spies, coded messages, and hidden communications to gain advantages, anticipate threats, and maintain their precarious hold on power. This was the dark underbelly of medieval information flow, where unseen hands worked to uncover or conceal vital intelligence. Imagine a shadowy figure slipping through the back alleys of a foreign capital, their ears open to whispers in taverns, their eyes scanning for telltale signs. Medieval spies were not the highly organized intelligence agents of modern fiction. Instead, they were often informers, disgruntled nobles, opportunistic merchants, disaffected clergy, or even seemingly innocuous travelers, paid to relay observations. Their methods were rudimentary but effective. Eavesdropping on conversations, bribing disgruntled servants, or simply paying close attention to troop movements, supply lines, or shifts in a rival's court. These agents operated at immense personal risk. Discovery meant torture, execution, or, at best, imprisonment. The intelligence they gathered could be diverse and crucial. During wartime, spies would report on the size and disposition of enemy armies, their morale, and their supply routes. Imagine a nervous rider delivering a coded message revealing a planned ambush or the weaknesses in a besieged castle's defenses. In times of peace, the focus shifted to political intrigue, discovering marriage alliances, monitoring succession disputes, or uncovering plots against the crown. Knowing a rival lord's financial woes or their secret dealings with a foreign power could provide a decisive advantage in diplomacy or negotiation. To protect their vital intelligence and communicate securely, medieval figures resorted to early forms of hidden messages. Ciphers, though simple by modern standards, were used to encrypt sensitive letters. The simplest method was a substitution cipher, where each letter of the alphabet was replaced by another or by a symbol according to a prearranged key. For example, A might become Z, B become Y, and so on, a simple Caesar shift. Imagine a message where seemingly random letters, when correctly deciphered, revealed troop movements or battle plans. The effectiveness of such ciphers relied heavily on the widespread illiteracy of the time. Most people couldn't read at all, let alone decipher a coded message without a key. However, even these basic ciphers were vulnerable to frequency analysis if enough text was available. Beyond simple substitution, early forms of polyalphabetic ciphers began to emerge in the later Middle Ages, though they were still far from modern complexity. These involved using multiple substitution alphabets, making decryption more challenging. Medieval scholars and cryptographers, though not yet a formalized profession, experimented with these methods, constantly seeking to improve message security. Another technique for hidden communication was steganography, the art of concealing the very existence of the message rather than just its meaning. This could be surprisingly ingenious. A message might be written in invisible ink, such as lemon juice, which becomes visible when heated, between the lines of a seemingly innocuous letter. Imagine a seemingly routine letter from a merchant containing secret instructions written in a hidden layer. Another method involved writing on a wooden tablet, covering it with wax, and then inscribing a public message on the wax, concealing the real content beneath. More dramatically, a message might be written on a piece of cloth that was then rolled into a small ball and swallowed by a messenger, or even sewn into the hem of their clothing. The reasons for using such secret methods were manifold. In warfare, coded messages communicated battle strategies, intelligence on enemy forces, or requests for reinforcements, all of which could be disastrous if intercepted. During periods of political intrigue, secret correspondence allowed rival factions within a court or between kingdoms to conspire without detection. Imagine secret alliances being forged through encrypted letters, or plots to overthrow a monarch being discussed in veiled terms. For religious minorities or dissenters, coded messages were essential for organizing and communicating without attracting the attention of the church or secular authorities, particularly during times of intense persecution. Even lovers separated by distance or societal constraints might use simple codes to exchange intimate messages, free from the prying eyes of family or servants. The inherent risks were enormous. If a messenger was captured or a coded letter intercepted, the consequences could be severe, leading to imprisonment, torture, or execution. The very act of sending or receiving a secret message was an act of courage and defiance. This constant game of cat and mouse between those who sought to conceal and those who sought to reveal created a layer of tension and suspicion within medieval society. While medieval cryptography was rudimentary compared to later developments, it highlights a persistent human need, the desire to control and protect information deemed too sensitive for open dissemination. In a world where every piece of written communication was rare and valuable, the choice to encode or hide a message underscored its immense importance. Far from grappling with too much information, medieval individuals and powers often found themselves desperately trying to secure the few critical pieces of knowledge they possessed, using ingenuity and secrecy to keep their hidden truths safe.
Step into the cacophony of a medieval market square. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies. Merchants hawk their wares, livestock bleats, and 1,000 conversations weave through the throng. Amidst this vibrant tapestry of daily life, an unseen force is constantly at work, the informal news networks of gossip and rumor. For the vast majority of medieval people, illiterate and cut off from official channels, these spontaneous, human-centered exchanges were their primary source of information, shaping public opinion and spreading news, both factual and wildly embellished. Imagine two women haggling over the price of chickens. Their conversation, seemingly mundane, subtly shifts to the latest news from the nearby lord's castle. Perhaps a new tax is rumored, or a traveling merchant has just arrived with tales from a distant city. This seemingly innocent exchange is a vital node in the medieval information web. News, whether factual or fabricated, traveled predominantly by word of mouth, passing from person to person, often amplified and distorted with each retelling. The market, the tavern, the church porch, and even the communal well were the social hubs where this informal news exchange thrived. People gathered not just to trade goods or worship, but to connect, share stories, and learn what was happening in their world. The market, in particular, was a melting pot of information. Farmers coming from the countryside brought news from their villages. Traveling merchants introduced tidbits from other towns or even foreign lands.
Pilgrims on their arduous journeys carried tales from distant shrines and communities. Gossip was the bloodline of this network. It often centered on local affairs: who was getting married, who was sick, who was in trouble with the Lord. But it also extended to broader topics, particularly those that affected daily life. A rumor about a poor harvest in a neighboring county could send market prices soaring. Speculation about an impending war could cause widespread anxiety. The arrival of a stranger in town might spark whispers about their origins and intentions. The nature of rumor, however, meant that accuracy was often the casualty. Without official verification or documented sources, information could easily be embellished, misinterpreted, or outright invented. A small truth could balloon into a monstrous lie, amplified by fear, superstition, or malicious intent. Imagine a distant report of a skirmish becoming a tale of a full-scale invasion by the time it reached the local tavern. A perceived injustice by the local lord could morph into a widespread grievance, fueled by angry whispers. This informal network had immense power to shape public opinion and even spark social unrest. Rumors about tyrannical lords, unjust taxes, or even impending natural disasters could spread like wildfire, inciting fear, discontent, and sometimes rebellion. The authorities were keenly aware of this. While town criers provided official news, they couldn't entirely counteract the pervasive influence of the grapevine. Rulers sometimes employed spies to listen in on market gossip, trying to gauge the mood of the populace and identify sources of dissent. The transmission of information through gossip was also heavily influenced by personal biases, fears, and hopes. A story told by someone who disliked the local reeve might paint him in the worst possible light. A tale of a miraculous healing might grow more fantastical with each telling, fueled by people's desire for hope. This deeply human element meant that the medieval news feed was less about objective facts and more about shared interpretations and emotional reactions to events. In a world where formal channels of communication were slow, expensive, and often inaccessible, market gossip and rumors were the vital, if unreliable, pulse of public knowledge. They highlight the fundamental human need to connect, to share, and to understand their world, even when that understanding was built on a shifting foundation of whispers and conjecture. For the medieval commoner, too much information was rarely a burden. Rather, it was a constant, almost thrilling struggle to discern meaning and truth from the swirling currents of informal news that surrounded their daily lives. The vibrant hum of the market square was, in essence, the very first social media platform, constantly alive with the unfiltered, sometimes wild flow of human information.
Medieval education. Who learned what and why? To understand medieval information, we must first understand medieval education, a landscape far removed from our modern systems of universal schooling. In this era, learning wasn't a universal right, but a carefully guarded privilege, largely dictated by one's social standing, gender, and intended role in society. The question of who learned what and why reveals a profoundly stratified approach to knowledge access, where literacy was a rare commodity, and formal instruction was often tied to religious or noble pursuits. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants and rural laborers who formed the backbone of medieval society, formal education was almost non-existent. Their learning was overwhelmingly practical and oral. Children learned the skills necessary for survival and subsistence from their parents and elders: farming techniques, animal husbandry, basic crafts, and the rhythms of the seasons. They absorbed local customs, folklore, and religious beliefs through storytelling, songs, and participation in community life. Their knowledge was deeply tied to their immediate environment and the cyclical nature of their agrarian existence. For them, education meant the transmission of essential life skills, not the mastery of written texts. For those higher up the social ladder, opportunities for formal learning gradually emerged. Monastic schools were the earliest and most significant centers of learning in the early Middle Ages. These schools primarily educated aspiring monks and clergy, teaching them to read and write Latin, the language of scripture and theological study. The curriculum centered on the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the 7 liberal arts. The purpose was largely to enable them to understand the Bible, participate in liturgical services, and engage with the works of the Church Fathers. Imagine young novices meticulously copying texts, their hands guided by older monks, their minds slowly grappling with the complexities of Latin grammar and philosophical reasoning. As towns grew and commerce expanded in the High Middle Ages, a need for literate individuals and secular roles arose. Cathedral schools began to serve a wider, though still elite, audience, often educating sons of nobility and wealthy merchants. These schools prepared individuals for careers in the church, but also in royal administration, law, and even medicine. Practical skills like accounting or letter writing for business might also be taught. The most transformative development in medieval education was the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, places like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salamanca. These weren't public institutions, but rather guilds of masters and students, specializing in particular disciplines. Students, typically male and from the upper echelons of society, would gather to study canon law, civil law, medicine, or theology, the most prestigious faculty. The teaching method was primarily lecture-based, with masters reading and commenting on authoritative texts, followed by disputations or formal debates, where students honed their logical and rhetorical skills. Literacy rates remained remarkably low across the general population. While some urban artisans and merchants might have possessed rudimentary literacy for business transactions, full literacy, the ability to read and write complex texts, was largely confined to the clergy, the nobility, and a small educated elite. The cost of books, the scarcity of schools, and the economic necessity of child labor all contributed to this limited access. For women, educational opportunities were even more restricted. Nuns received an education similar to monks, and some aristocratic women might be tutored at home, learning to read for religious devotion or household management. However, formal public education for women was virtually unheard of. The medieval education system, though limited in its reach, was remarkably effective in preserving and transmitting the intellectual heritage of its time. It was a world where formal knowledge was carefully controlled, its dissemination slow and deliberate. For those who gained access to it, education was a profound privilege, unlocking the scarce treasures of written information and shaping their understanding of a world where wisdom was often seen as divine and knowledge a journey to God.
Almanacs and calendars, managing time and knowledge. In the medieval world, life was profoundly intertwined with the rhythms of nature and the dictates of faith. Without precise clocks or widespread literacy, the organization of daily life, agriculture, and religious observance relied heavily on essential, practical documents, almanacs, and calendars. These weren't just tools for marking time, they were vital repositories of knowledge, guiding medieval people through the seasons, influencing their work, and shaping their spiritual lives. Imagine a farmer looking at a simple, hand-drawn calendar tacked inside his cottage, or a monk consulting a more elaborate, illuminated manuscript. These calendars were far more than just lists of days. They meticulously charted the Christian liturgical year, marking feast days, saints' days, and fasting periods. For a deeply religious society, knowing when to observe these holy days was paramount. Each day carried specific religious significance, impacting everything from diet to celebratory customs. The calendar was thus a constant reminder of one's spiritual obligations and the unfolding narrative of salvation history. Beyond the religious, medieval calendars and almanacs were packed with practical knowledge essential for an agrarian society. They often included astronomical information, the phases of the moon, the rising and setting of certain constellations, and the solstices and equinoxes. This wasn't merely academic, it was crucial for telling time, navigating, and, most importantly, for agriculture. The moon's phases dictated the best times for planting, harvesting, and even cutting timber. The position of the stars could signal the changing seasons, guiding farmers on when to sow their seeds or prepare for winter. Furthermore, almanacs often included meteorological predictions, often based on astrological observations or long-held folk wisdom. While not scientifically accurate, these forecasts offered guidance for farming decisions, such as when to expect a harsh winter that could threaten his crops and livestock. Imagine a medieval farmer nervously consulting his almanac for signs of a harsh winter that could threaten his crops and livestock. They also often included medical advice and remedies based on the prevailing humoral theory of medicine, which posited that the body was made of 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. An almanac might suggest the best times for bloodletting, the properties of certain herbs, or remedies for common ailments, often linking these recommendations to specific astrological alignments. Imagine a worried mother checking her almanac for a suggested cure for her child's fever, a mix of ancient knowledge and common superstition. Astrology played a significant role in many almanacs. The belief that celestial bodies influenced human affairs and natural phenomena was widespread. Almanacs would often include tables indicating planetary positions and zodiacal signs, which were then used to predict fortunes, determine auspicious times for journeys or important decisions, and even influence medical treatments. For the medieval mind, the cosmos was a living, interconnected system, and almanacs provided a window into its perceived workings. The length and complexity of these documents varied. Simple wooden or bone calendars with carved notches might track lunar cycles for peasants. More elaborate manuscript almanacs, often highly illustrated, were prized possessions of the literate elite, scholars, and wealthy landowners. These could be incredibly detailed, containing information on tides, sunrises and sunsets, and even historical anniversaries. For a society where formal timekeeping devices like clocks were rare and expensive, and even then not widely portable, almanacs and calendars provided the essential framework for organizing life. They ensured that religious festivals were observed correctly, that agricultural activities were synchronized with the natural world, and that people had a reference point for understanding the passage of time and the cyclical nature of existence. In essence, these were the medieval world's essential data points, miniature encyclopedias of practical and spiritual knowledge. They were consulted not just for a date, but for guidance on almost every significant aspect of daily life, from planting a crop to treating an illness. They represent a fascinating blend of scientific observation, religious devotion, and folk tradition, all combined to help medieval people navigate their world and manage the information they needed to survive and thrive. Far from being a burden of too much information, they were precisely the right amount of curated, essential knowledge, neatly packaged for the needs of the time.
Tapestries, stained glass, and art as information. In the medieval landscape, where the vast majority of the population couldn't read, visual storytelling wasn't merely decorative. It was a primary mode of information dissemination. Imagine stepping into a grand cathedral, its walls shimmering with stained glass windows that glow like jewels, or walking through a lord's great hall adorned with monumental tapestries. These weren't just artistic expressions.
They were immersive visual narratives designed to convey complex stories, historical events, and religious lessons to an audience that read images rather than words. The church, recognizing the power of images, was a master of visual communication. Stained glass windows in cathedrals and parish churches served as Biblia Pauperum, Bibles for the poor. Each vibrant panel depicted scenes from the Old and New Testaments, the lives of saints, or parables, arranged in sequences that allowed the viewer to follow a narrative. Imagine a villager, unable to decipher Latin scripture, standing transfixed before a window depicting the story of creation or the dramatic crucifixion of Christ. The vivid colors, symbolic gestures, and dramatic compositions provided a powerful and memorable way to absorb theological concepts and moral lessons. The light streaming through the glass added a mystical, divine quality to the narrative, reinforcing the sacredness of the stories. Similarly, frescoes and murals adorning church walls served a similar purpose. From humble parish churches to grand monastic refectories, these painted narratives brought scripture and saintly deeds to life. The arrangement of scenes, the depiction of key figures, and the inclusion of symbolic elements were carefully planned to convey specific messages and reinforce orthodox beliefs. They were a constant visual sermon, accessible to everyone who entered the sacred space. Beyond the religious sphere, tapestries served as monumental forms of secular visual storytelling, particularly in the homes of the wealthy and powerful. The Bayeux Tapestry is perhaps the most famous example. This incredible 70-meter-long embroidered cloth depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England and the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Imagine a medieval lord and his retinue walking along its length, reading the visual chronicle of William the Conqueror's triumph. Each scene meticulously detailed with figures, ships, horses, and even Latin inscriptions, which would have been read aloud to explain the scenes to an audience, told a specific part of the unfolding historical drama. It was a dynamic, portable piece of history, far more engaging and accessible than any written chronicle for most people. Other tapestries might depict epic romances, mythological tales, hunting scenes, or allegories, filling the vast, cold spaces of medieval castles and manors with color and narrative. They were a statement of wealth and prestige, but also a constant source of information and entertainment, allowing their viewers to immerse themselves in complex stories without needing to decode a single letter. The effectiveness of visual storytelling lay in its universality. Images transcended linguistic barriers and literacy levels. A symbol, a halo indicating sainthood, a crown indicating royalty, a specific animal representing a vice or virtue, was instantly recognizable. Artists, though not necessarily authors in the modern sense, were crucial communicators, translating complex ideas and narratives into understandable visual forms. They employed conventions and symbols that were widely understood within their cultural context, creating a shared visual lexicon. This reliance on visual information highlights a fundamental difference in how knowledge was consumed in the Middle Ages. Our modern world is saturated with written text. Theirs was often dominated by compelling images. For medieval people, art was information. It taught them history, morality, religious doctrine, and even social hierarchies. It was an immersive and powerful way to understand their world, providing a constant stream of narrative and meaning that compensated for the scarcity of printed words. In a world where too much information was never the burden, visual storytelling ensured that the essential narratives, whether sacred or secular, were deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness.
The printing press, the information revolution that was yet to come. As the medieval period drew to a close, a quiet revolution was brewing,
one that would irrevocably alter the landscape of information, moving it from scarcity to, eventually, abundance. This revolution was the invention of the printing press, specifically Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press in the mid-15th century. While its immediate impact on medieval information overload was negligible, its long-term consequences were monumental, laying the groundwork for an entirely new era of knowledge dissemination. Imagine a world where every single book, every single document had to be meticulously copied by hand. This was the reality for over 1,000 years. Monks and scribes spent lifetimes producing individual manuscripts, making books incredibly expensive, rare, and prone to scribal errors. The very act of reading was often a privileged scholarly pursuit limited to the elite. The information ecosystem was one of painstaking creation and limited access. Gutenberg's innovation in Mainz, Germany, around 1450, didn't immediately flood Europe with books. It was a gradual process, but the potential was clear. The core genius lay in movable type, individual metal letters that could be arranged to form words, lines, and pages, then inked and pressed onto paper. Once a page was printed, the types could be rearranged to print an entirely different page. This was a radical departure from woodblock printing, where an entire page was carved from a single block, making corrections or reuse impossible, or the labor-intensive hand copying. The immediate impact was felt primarily in the production of religious texts. Gutenberg's most famous creation, the Gutenberg Bible, demonstrated the press's capacity to produce multiple identical copies of a large, complex work with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Previously, a single Bible could take years for a team of scribes to copy. Now, hundreds could be produced in the same time frame. This meant that religious texts could be disseminated more widely, though still primarily among the clergy and literate elite at first. However, the printing press quickly moved beyond just Bibles. Pamphlets, broadsides, and small books on various subjects began to appear. These early printed materials were often relatively short, covering current events like battles or royal proclamations, religious tracts, moralizing tales, or practical guides. They were cheaper to produce than manuscripts, and, though still expensive by modern standards, they were significantly more affordable than their handwritten counterparts. This lower cost, combined with the growing urban population and merchant class, slowly began to foster a greater demand for literacy. The implications for information dissemination were profound. Firstly, it enabled standardization. Multiple copies of the same text could be produced, all identical, reducing the variations and errors inherent in hand copying. This meant that scholars across Europe could refer to the same version of a classical text or a theological treatise, fostering more accurate and consistent scholarship. Secondly, it dramatically increased the speed and volume of production. While a scribe might produce a few pages a day, a printing press could produce hundreds. This meant that news, ideas, and knowledge could spread with a speed previously unimaginable. For the first time, intellectual movements could gain momentum more rapidly, as new theories or dissenting opinions could reach a wider audience faster. And thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, the printing press directly contributed to the rise of literacy. As books became more available and less expensive, there was a greater incentive for people to learn to read. Over time, this would lead to a more informed populace capable of engaging directly with written information, rather than relying solely on oral tradition or priestly interpretation. While the information overload we associate with the digital age was centuries away, the printing press was the nascent spark of that phenomenon. It didn't immediately overwhelm medieval minds with an excess of news, but it introduced the potential for such a deluge. It laid the foundation for the Reformation by enabling the mass production of vernacular Bibles and reformist tracts, the scientific revolution by allowing the rapid dissemination of new scientific discoveries, and, eventually, the Enlightenment.
The printing press was the slow-burning fuse that would eventually ignite the explosion of information that characterizes our modern world, transforming knowledge from a rare, carefully guarded commodity into a force that would eventually become abundant and sometimes overwhelming.
The marketplace of ideas, philosophers, and debates. While medieval society often appears rigid and structured, beneath the surface of monastic quietude and feudal hierarchy, a vibrant marketplace of ideas thrummed with intellectual energy. Within the nascent universities, and to a lesser extent in the intellectual circles of royal courts and cathedrals, philosophers and scholars engaged in rigorous debates that shaped the very understanding of the world. This was where knowledge was not just preserved, but actively contested, refined, and expanded, demonstrating that even in an age of scarcity, intellectual discourse could be remarkably dynamic. Imagine the grand halls of the University of Paris or Oxford in the 13th century. Here, masters and students, predominantly men, would gather for lectures and, crucially, for disputations. The disputation, or disputatio, was the cornerstone of medieval scholasticism. Far more than a simple discussion, it was a highly formalized intellectual contest, a public display of logical prowess and argumentative skill. A master would propose a question, or a quaestio, often a complex theological or philosophical problem, and students would then argue for or against it, citing authorities and employing intricate logical arguments. The purpose of these debates was not necessarily to discover entirely new truths, but rather to reconcile apparent contradictions within established authorities, primarily Aristotle and Christian scripture. Scholars sought to demonstrate that faith and reason were not inherently opposed, but could coexist and even illuminate each other. Figures like Thomas Aquinas, whose monumental Summa Theologica is a testament to this method, rigorously analyzed and debated every conceivable question, from the nature of God to the morality of usury, by presenting opposing arguments, refuting them, and then offering a synthesized conclusion. The topics of these debates were incredibly broad, encompassing theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. Questions ranged from the sublime, like does God exist, to the practical, is it lawful to own property? Imagine the intellectual intensity as scholars grappled with concepts like free will, the nature of universals, or the relationship between soul and body, all within a framework deeply informed by Christian doctrine and classical philosophy. This intellectual dynamism was fueled by the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the works of Aristotle, often arriving in Latin translation from Arabic sources. These texts presented new philosophical frameworks and scientific observations that sometimes challenged existing understandings, forcing scholars to grapple with complex reconciliations. The influx of new knowledge, though slow, prompted intense intellectual ferment. While highly structured, these debates fostered critical thinking and rigorous argumentation. Students learned to identify logical fallacies, construct persuasive arguments, and defend their positions against intellectual challenge. The public nature of many disputations meant that a scholar's reputation could rise or fall based on their performance, creating an incentive for intellectual excellence. Beyond the formal university setting, intellectual discourse also occurred in royal courts, where learned advisors debated matters of policy and governance, and in private study circles among the educated elite. However, the university environment provided the most organized and fertile ground for the systematic exchange and testing of ideas. It's important to remember that this marketplace of ideas was still a relatively exclusive arena. Participation was limited to those with access to education, predominantly men from privileged backgrounds.
Debates often took place in Latin, further limiting their reach. However, the intellectual traditions forged in these debates would have a profound and lasting impact on Western thought, laying the groundwork for the scientific and philosophical revolutions that would follow. The medieval scholastic method, with its emphasis on questioning, disputation, and reconciliation, demonstrates that even when too much information was not the problem, the human intellect relentlessly sought to organize, understand, and refine the knowledge that was available. It was a testament to the enduring power of intellectual inquiry, proving that even within a framework of scarcity and established authority, ideas could be vibrant, contested, and ultimately transformative.
Medical knowledge, remedies, recipes, and folklore. Imagine a medieval village, the harsh realities of daily life, the ever-present threat of disease, and the stark limitations of medical understanding. In this world, medical knowledge was a fascinating, often perplexing blend of ancient wisdom, rudimentary scientific observation, deep-seated superstition, and practical folk tradition. It wasn't a systematized science as we know it, but a patchwork of remedies, recipes, and folklore passed down through generations, each offering a glimmer of hope against the relentless tide of illness and suffering. The foundational theory of medieval medicine was the humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. This theory posited that the human body was composed of 4 cardinal humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or choler, and black bile, or melancholy. Health was believed to be a state of balance among these humors, while illness resulted from an imbalance. Treatments, therefore, aimed to restore this equilibrium. Imagine a physician examining a patient, considering their temperament, the color of their skin, and the nature of their symptoms, all interpreted through the lens of humoral imbalance. Based on this theory, common treatments included bloodletting to reduce excess blood, purging to remove excess bile or phlegm, and the application of poultices or herbal remedies designed to cool or warm the humors. Physicians, though few and largely confined to urban centers, would consult medical texts derived from classical Arabic and Greek sources, which contained elaborate discussions of disease, anatomy, though often based on animal dissection rather than human, and complex diagnostic methods like urine analysis. However, for the vast majority of people, medical care was far more localized and practical. Barber surgeons, for instance, performed operations like tooth extractions, wound stitching, and even rudimentary amputations, often in unsanitary conditions. They learned through apprenticeship and direct experience, their knowledge passed down through practical demonstration. Apothecaries prepared and sold herbal concoctions, often based on long-standing recipes in herbals, illustrated books detailing the medicinal properties of plants. But perhaps the most widespread and accessible medical knowledge came from folk tradition and the wisdom of wise women or local healers. These individuals, often working outside the formal medical establishment, possessed an extensive knowledge of local plants, their healing properties, and traditional remedies passed down through generations. Imagine a village woman gathering specific herbs from the forest, knowing instinctively which plant could soothe a fever or heal a wound. This practical medical knowledge, often passed down from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, was a cornerstone of community health, vital for both humans and livestock. Superstition and religious belief were also deeply interwoven with medical practice. Illness was often seen as divine punishment or the work of evil spirits or witchcraft. Prayers, pilgrimages, and the veneration of saints were common approaches to healing. Charms, amulets, and specific rituals were employed alongside more practical remedies. Imagine a patient wearing a magical amulet to ward off disease, alongside taking an herbal decoction.
This highlights the complex worldview where the spiritual and physical realms were not distinctly separate. Information about health was shared through oral tradition within families and communities. Recipes for herbal infusions, salves, and poultices were verbally transmitted from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. This informal network was the primary health information system for most people. Written medical texts, when they existed, were often dense, in Latin, and largely inaccessible to the common person. The medieval understanding of hygiene was also rudimentary, leading to widespread disease. The lack of sanitation, contaminated water sources, and inadequate waste disposal meant that epidemics like the Black Death could devastate entire populations. Medical knowledge, for all its efforts, was often powerless against such scourges. In this context, too much information about medicine was never the problem. Rather, it was a chronic scarcity of accurate, effective knowledge. The mix of genuine empirical observation, classical theory, folk wisdom, and deep-seated superstition meant that medieval medical practice was often a precarious gamble, a testament to humanity's enduring struggle against illness with the limited tools and understanding available to them. Each remedy, each recipe, was a hopeful attempt to bring comfort and healing in a world where disease was a constant, terrifying companion.
Maps and exploration, expanding the known world. For the medieval mind, the world was a canvas both familiar and mysterious, intricately woven with both observed reality and deeply held beliefs. Maps in this era were far more than just navigational tools. They were vibrant expressions of accumulated geographic knowledge, philosophical worldview, and vivid imagination, chronicling the slow, arduous process of expanding the known world through trade, pilgrimage, and eventually daring exploration. Imagine a medieval scholar poring over a mappa mundi, a map of the world. These weren't scaled, accurate representations of continents as we know them. Instead, they were often circular, oriented with East, Jerusalem, at the top, and filled with a fascinating blend of geographical data, biblical history, and mythological creatures. Jerusalem was often placed at the center, reflecting its spiritual significance. Continents were represented broadly, with Europe, Asia, and Africa generally outlined, but often with distorted proportions. The oceans, particularly the vast unknown beyond the Pillars of Hercules, were often depicted as dangerous, inhabited by sea monsters, or bounded by lands of mythical beings. Early medieval maps were primarily conceptual and theological rather than practical. They were meant to illustrate salvation history and humanity's place in the divine cosmos. They depicted the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, and the lands of biblical figures alongside actual cities and rivers. For instance, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a masterpiece from the late 13th century, is a grand example of this type, filled with intricate details, moral lessons, and mythical beasts alongside recognizable geography. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, driven by increased trade, pilgrimages, and military campaigns like the Crusades, geographic knowledge slowly began to expand, and maps became more practical. Portolan charts, developed in the Mediterranean for navigation, emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries. These were much more accurate, focusing on coastlines, harbors, and rhumb lines, or lines showing constant bearing, for sailors. Imagine a ship's captain using a Portolan chart to navigate from Genoa to Alexandria, relying on its practical detail for safe passage. These charts were a distinct shift towards empirical observation, born out of the necessity of maritime commerce. The explorers of the medieval period, though perhaps not as famous as their Renaissance successors, played a crucial role in pushing the boundaries of the known world. Viking voyages across the North Atlantic reached Greenland and even North America, Vinland, centuries before Columbus, though their geographical knowledge was largely contained within their own sagas and oral traditions, not widely disseminated across Europe. The Crusades brought Europeans into direct contact with the Middle East and its advanced Arab scholarship, including their sophisticated cartography and astronomical knowledge. Arab geographers, building on ancient Greek foundations, produced incredibly detailed and accurate maps, some of which influenced European cartography. The overland journeys of merchants and missionaries like Marco Polo in the late 13th century opened up the vastness of Asia to the European imagination. While Polo's descriptions of China and its riches were initially met with skepticism, they sparked immense curiosity and a desire for more accurate information about the East. Imagine the wonder and disbelief as his tales of distant empires and exotic cultures were recounted, slowly challenging the Eurocentric worldview. The information from these explorations trickled back slowly, often mixed with hearsay and exaggeration. Mapmakers struggled to incorporate new discoveries into existing frameworks, leading to fascinating hybrid maps that combined new data with traditional beliefs. The very act of mapping was a constant negotiation between observation and pre-existing knowledge. For medieval people, maps were not just guides. They were windows into the vast, often terrifying unknown. They reflected humanity's limited but growing understanding of their planet. The existence of mythical creatures on maps served as both warnings and fascinations, embodying the blurred lines between fact and folklore that permeated medieval knowledge. Too much information was never the issue. Rather, it was the tantalizing scarcity, the yearning to fill in the blank spaces, and the slow, incremental process of bringing the vast, distant world into the realm of the known. Maps were thus powerful documents of both discovery and enduring mystery, reflecting a world constantly on the cusp of expansion.
Reading narrative story. Court chronicles and annals. Writing history as power. In the intricate tapestry of medieval power, where dynastic legitimacy and political authority often hinged on precedent and perception, writing history was never a neutral act. For rulers and their courts, chronicles and annals were far more than simple records of events. They were potent instruments of power, carefully crafted to shape their legacies, justify their actions, and control public memory for generations to come. Imagine a highly educated cleric or learned knight appointed specifically to record the events of the realm. This was the role of the court chronicler, a privileged position whose task was to document significant occurrences, military campaigns, royal births, deaths, and marriages, and the reign of their patron. These individuals, often living at the heart of power, had access to official documents and personal knowledge of court intrigues. However, their proximity also meant their objectivity was often compromised. The primary purpose of a court chronicle was to legitimize and glorify the ruling dynasty. Imagine a chronicle meticulously detailing a king's triumphs in battle, his piety, or his wise governance, while subtly downplaying his defeats, his vices, or his political blunders. The narrative was carefully constructed to portray the monarch in the most favorable light, enhancing their prestige and reinforcing their divine right to rule. A chronicler might emphasize a royal lineage tracing back to legendary figures or even biblical patriarchs, solidifying the family's claim to the throne. These chronicles were also used to shape public memory. For example, after a contentious succession or a civil war, a chronicler might subtly rewrite history to present the victorious faction as the rightful heirs, their opponents as rebels or traitors. Accounts of military campaigns would often inflate enemy casualties and minimize friendly losses, ensuring a narrative of decisive victory. This control over historical narrative was crucial for maintaining stability and discouraging dissent. In a society with limited literacy, these carefully crafted histories, often read aloud to the nobility, became the accepted version of events.
The genre of annals was a simpler, more rudimentary form of historical record. Annals typically recorded events year by year, often in a brief, factual manner, sometimes with minimal commentary. They might note the death of a king, a significant battle, a severe famine, or a new bishop's appointment. These were often compiled in monasteries, serving as reference points for the monk's own historical understanding. While less overtly propagandistic than court chronicles, even annals could subtly reflect the biases or priorities of their compilers. Examples abound across medieval Europe. Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, written in the 6th century, provides invaluable insight into Merovingian Gaul, though it's deeply shaped by his own ecclesiastical perspective and moral judgments. Later, works like Froissart's Chronicles vividly depict the Hundred Years' War, offering rich detail from various perspectives, though still influenced by the chronicler's patrons and personal connections. Anglo-Saxon chronicles, compiled over centuries, offer a unique, if sometimes sparse, record of English history from a distinct Anglo-Saxon viewpoint. The production of these histories was a meticulous undertaking, usually by hand, making them rare and highly valued. They were not for mass consumption, but for the king, his immediate circle, and future generations of the elite. Their existence served as a tangible link to the past, providing continuity and validation for ongoing rule. In essence, medieval court chronicles and annals were a powerful form of information management and manipulation. They highlight that even in an age of scarce information, the concept of truth was often flexible, tailored to serve political objectives. Rulers understood that controlling the past was a key to controlling the present and the future. By commissioning and preserving these carefully constructed histories, they ensured that their version of events, their narrative of power, would endure, becoming the accepted historical record for centuries to come, long after the noise of battle and the whispers of court intrigue had faded away.
Myth, legend, and fact. Blurred lines in medieval storytelling. In the medieval consciousness, the boundaries between what we today categorize as myth, legend, and undeniable fact were far more fluid and permeable. Imagine a world where dragons might realistically inhabit distant lands, where saints performed tangible miracles daily, and where the lineage of kings often intertwined with the divine. Medieval storytelling, whether oral or written, seamlessly blended these elements, shaping public knowledge and influencing beliefs and decisions in profound ways. For medieval people, the universe was a place alive with spiritual forces and wonders, where the natural and supernatural frequently converged. This worldview meant that mythical beings and legendary heroes were not necessarily seen as mere fiction, but rather as potentially real entities or historical figures whose deeds had taken on extraordinary dimensions through time and retelling. The existence of monstrous races in distant lands or the miraculous powers of relics was often accepted as readily as the fact of a king's reign. Consider the pervasive influence of Christian myth and legend. Stories of saints performing miracles, direct interventions by angels or demons, or the literal existence of heaven and hell were central to medieval understanding. These weren't allegories, they were believed realities that profoundly impacted daily life and moral choices. Pilgrims embarked on perilous journeys to touch relics, believing in their tangible healing power. Preachers recounted vivid tales of saints to inspire piety and moral conduct. These narratives served as powerful teaching tools, reinforcing religious dogma and shaping individual behavior. Alongside religious narratives, heroic legends held immense sway. The tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, for example, were incredibly popular.
While modern historians debate Arthur's historical existence, for medieval audiences he was a real, albeit idealized, king who embodied chivalric virtues and Christian ideals. These stories, whether recounted by bards or read in illuminated manuscripts, provided moral exemplars, shaped aristocratic behavior, and fostered a sense of national identity. Imagine knights striving to emulate Lancelot's bravery or Galahad's purity, their actions guided by the virtues presented in these narratives. The mixing of fact and legend also extended to historical accounts. Medieval chroniclers often incorporated legendary origins for noble families, tracing their lineage back to figures from the Trojan War or even Adam. These mythical ancestries weren't seen as deliberate falsehoods, but rather as ways to imbue a family with greater prestige and legitimacy. The past was understood not as a purely factual sequence of events, but as a grand narrative where divine providence and heroic deeds played a central role. The chronicler's aim was often to explain the meaning of history rather than to present a detached empirical account. This blurring of lines was partly due to the nature of oral tradition, where stories naturally evolve and accumulate embellishments over generations. A heroic deed might become grander, a villain more monstrous, and a miracle more spectacular with each retelling. With limited written records and little critical analysis of sources, by modern standards, distinguishing between reported fact and added fiction was challenging. The very act of storytelling was about conveying profound truths, even if the details were fantastical. The impact of this interwoven narrative was significant. It fostered a shared cultural understanding, where a common pool of stories and beliefs informed people's worldview. It provided moral guidance, entertainment, and a sense of connection to a grander past and a divinely ordered universe. For instance, the legend of a local saint might dictate pilgrimage routes or influence medical practices. A prophecy embedded within a seemingly historical account could influence political decisions or spark popular movements. In the medieval mind, truth was often multifaceted, encompassing not just empirical observation, but also spiritual conviction and the enduring power of narrative. Too much information was never the issue, but rather how to synthesize the available information, whether factual report or cherished legend, into a coherent understanding of their complex and wondrous world. The medieval landscape was thus populated not just by people, animals, and buildings, but a vibrant host of saints, dragons, and legendary heroes, all contributing to the rich, living fabric of knowledge.
In the high-stakes world of medieval politics, warfare, and religious intrigue, not all information was meant for public consumption. Beneath the official pronouncements and open communications lay a clandestine realm of coded messages and secret languages, where hidden knowledge could mean the difference between victory and defeat, loyalty and betrayal, or even life and death. Imagine spies whispering encrypted reports, conspirators exchanging disguised notes, or lovers sending passionate letters veiled from prying eyes. This hidden stream of information was a critical element of medieval communication, designed for intrigue, security, and rebellion. The simplest and most common method of creating a coded message was the substitution cipher. This involved replacing each letter of the alphabet with another letter, a number, or a symbol, according to a prearranged key. For example, A might become Z, B become Y, and so on. A simple Caesar cipher shift. Imagine a king's general receiving a dispatch where seemingly random letters, when correctly deciphered, reveal troop movements or battle plans. The effectiveness of such ciphers relied heavily on the widespread illiteracy of the time. Most people couldn't read at all, let alone decipher a coded message without a key. However, even these basic ciphers were vulnerable to frequency analysis if enough text was available. Beyond simple substitution, early forms of polyalphabetic ciphers began to emerge in the later Middle Ages, though they were still far from modern complexity. These involved using multiple substitution alphabets, making decryption more challenging. Medieval scholars and cryptographers, though not yet a formalized profession, experimented with these methods, constantly seeking to improve message security. Another technique for hidden communication was steganography, the art of concealing the very existence of the message rather than just its meaning. This could be surprisingly ingenious. A message might be written in invisible ink, such as lemon juice, which becomes visible when heated, between the lines of a seemingly innocuous letter. Imagine a seemingly routine letter from a merchant containing secret instructions written in a hidden layer. Another method involved writing on a wooden tablet, covering it with wax, and then inscribing a public message on the wax, concealing the real content beneath. More dramatically, a message might be written on a piece of cloth that was then rolled into a small ball and swallowed by the messenger, or even sewn into the hem of their clothing. The reasons for using such secret methods were manifold. In warfare, coded messages communicated battle strategies, intelligence on enemy forces, or requests for reinforcements, all of which could be disastrous if intercepted. During periods of political intrigue, secret correspondence allowed rival factions within a court or between kingdoms to conspire without detection. Imagine secret alliances being forged through encrypted letters, or plots to overthrow a monarch being discussed in veiled terms. For religious minorities or dissenters, coded messages were essential for organizing and communicating without attracting the attention of the church or secular authorities, particularly during times of intense persecution. Even lovers separated by distance or societal constraints might use simple codes to exchange intimate messages, free from the prying eyes of family or servants. The inherent risks were enormous. If a messenger was captured or a coded letter intercepted, the consequences could be severe, leading to imprisonment, torture, or execution. The very act of sending or receiving a secret message was an act of courage and defiance. This constant game of cat and mouse between those who sought to conceal and those who sought to reveal created a layer of tension and suspicion within medieval society. While medieval cryptography was rudimentary compared to later developments, it highlights a persistent human need, the desire to control and protect information deemed too sensitive for open dissemination. In a world where every piece of written communication was rare and valuable, the choice to encode or hide a message underscored its immense importance. Far from grappling with too much information, medieval individuals and powers often found themselves desperately trying to secure the few critical pieces of knowledge they possessed, using ingenuity and secrecy to keep their hidden truths safe.
The role of women, keepers and spreaders of knowledge. When we imagine medieval knowledge, we often conjure images of monks in scriptoriums or scholars in universities. Yet, to overlook the role of women in this landscape would be to miss a vital, often understated, conduit of information. Despite limited access to formal education and public spheres, women were profound keepers and spreaders of knowledge within their families, households, and communities, embodying a different, yet equally crucial aspect of medieval information flow. For the vast majority of medieval women, particularly those in peasant and artisan classes, knowledge was primarily oral and practical. Their education began in the home, learning essential skills from their mothers and grandmothers.
This included domestic knowledge vital for survival, how to prepare food, preserve provisions, spin and weave textiles, manage a household, and care for children. Imagine a young girl learning the intricate process of cheese making from her mother, or the complex steps of dyeing wool, each step passed down through generations of hands-on instruction and verbal explanation. These weren't abstract theories, but essential, life-sustaining skills that defined daily existence. Women were also the primary custodians of folk medicine and herbal lore. In an age before widespread formal medical training, women were often the local healers, possessing a deep knowledge of medicinal plants, their properties, and traditional remedies for common ailments. Imagine a village woman collecting specific herbs from the forest, knowing instinctively which plant could soothe a fever or heal a wound. This practical medical knowledge, often passed down from mother to daughter, was a cornerstone of community health, vital for both humans and livestock. Beyond practical skills, women were central to the preservation of oral tradition, folklore, and songs. They were the lullaby singers, the storytellers at the hearth, passing on myths, legends, moral tales, and family histories to their children. Imagine a grandmother recounting tales of heroic ancestors or cautionary fables, instilling values and imparting cultural knowledge through narrative. These stories shaped the worldview of the young, binding them to their heritage and teaching them about their place in the world. In essence, they were the informal educators of society, shaping minds long before formal schooling was an option. While formal literacy was rare for women, it wasn't entirely absent. Nuns and convents received an education comparable to monks, learning Latin, reading scripture, and sometimes even contributing to the copying of manuscripts. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century, were polymaths, writing on theology, medicine, botany, and composing music, demonstrating the intellectual capacity of educated women within the monastic sphere. Among the aristocracy, some noble women were tutored at home, learning to read and write, often in vernacular languages, for managing large estates, overseeing household accounts, or engaging in religious devotion. These literate noblewomen could serve as patrons of literature or even as correspondents, influencing politics through their networks. In both rural and urban settings, women also played a significant role in spreading news and gossip. Whether at the communal well, the market, or during social visits, women exchanged information about local happenings, distant events relayed by travelers, and personal news. These informal networks were crucial for the flow of information, particularly in communities where official channels were scarce or inaccessible. While often dismissed as mere gossip, these exchanges were vital for community cohesion and awareness. The economic activities of women also made them information conduits. Women involved in trade, whether selling produce at market or managing urban shops, would gather and disseminate information about prices, goods, and commercial opportunities. The contributions of women to medieval knowledge are often unsung because their spheres of influence were largely domestic and informal, rather than the public and formal spaces dominated by men. Yet their role as keepers of practical wisdom, transmitters of cultural heritage, and vital nodes in informal communication networks was indispensable. They ensured the continuity of daily life, the health of families, and the vibrancy of community knowledge. In a world where too much information was never the issue, women tirelessly worked to ensure that essential knowledge, in its myriad forms, was preserved and passed on, often through the power of their voices and the wisdom of their hands.
The burden of too much news. Coping with information overload. The concept of too much information in the medieval world was profoundly different from our modern experience of digital deluge. There was no internet, no 24/7 news cycle, no instant global communication. Yet, even in an age of scarcity, medieval people faced their own forms of information overload, particularly when confronted with the overwhelming stress of rumors, prophecies, and the often sensationalized news of impending disaster. This segment explores how people handled these moments of intense, often terrifying information saturation and the social reactions that ensued. Imagine a sudden, terrifying rumor sweeping through a village. The Black Death is approaching, a foreign army is marching, or a devastating famine is imminent. Unlike today, where we might seek multiple sources to verify, medieval people often had few, if any, reliable means of confirmation. News, particularly bad news, often arrived piecemeal, distorted by fear and amplified by word of mouth. The lack of verifiable facts, coupled with intense uncertainty, could create a profound sense of anxiety and psychological burden. One of the most potent sources of overload was the news of plague and disease. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, information about its horrific spread, its symptoms, and its inevitability created a widespread panic. Whispers from travelers, the sight of abandoned villages, and the grim reality of mass deaths would flood communities with terrifying news, leading to widespread despair, social breakdown, and even flight. People were overwhelmed not by the volume of unrelated data, but by the intensity and existential threat of a single pervasive piece of information. Similarly, news of warfare and impending invasions could create immense psychological pressure. Imagine a border community receiving fragmented reports of an enemy army's advance, perhaps exaggerated in scope or cruelty by fleeing refugees. The uncertainty, the fear for their lives and livelihoods, and the desperate attempts to gather more concrete information would have been an overwhelming experience. Prophecies, often circulating orally or in cryptic texts, also contributed to this sense of overload. A prediction of the end of the world or the arrival of a divine judgment could cause widespread religious fervor, panic, or even social unrest as people grappled with the implications of such monumental information. How did medieval people cope with this unique form of too much news? Reliance on faith and spiritual solace. For many, the Church provided a framework for understanding and coping with overwhelming events. Plagues might be interpreted as divine punishment, prompting intense prayer, penance, or pilgrimage. This provided a spiritual outlet for their anxiety, a way to make sense of the incomprehensible. Communal response. Communities often face these challenges collectively. People would gather to share information and misinformation, to pray together, or to organize defenses against perceived threats. The very act of sharing the burden, even if it amplified the rumor, also provided a sense of solidarity. Flight and isolation. In extreme cases, communities would flee the source of overwhelming news, whether it was an approaching army or an outbreak of plague. This individual or collective flight was a drastic coping mechanism, an attempt to escape the overwhelming reality. Fatalism and acceptance. For others, particularly those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, a sense of fatalism might set in. Life was hard, and suffering was often seen as an unavoidable part of the human condition. This acceptance, while perhaps bleak, could also be a form of psychological defense against overwhelming despair. Blame and scapegoating. In times of extreme stress, overwhelming news often led to the search for scapegoats. Rumors could quickly turn into accusations against marginalized groups, such as Jews or witches, who were blamed for misfortunes like plague or famine. This was a dark manifestation of attempting to process overwhelming information by externalizing blame. Unlike our modern ability to mute notifications or filter news, medieval people had few defenses against the relentless tide of a terrifying rumor once it took hold. The pace might have been slower, but the emotional impact of such information overload was arguably far more intense and direct. It highlights the enduring human challenge of processing and reacting to distressing news, a challenge that, even without the digital age, could profoundly shape medieval stress and social reactions, often with devastating consequences. Early news media. pamphlets, broadsheets, and ballads. As the medieval period drew to a close and the printing press slowly began to take root, the information landscape started to evolve, giving rise to nascent forms of news media. These precursors to our modern newspapers and broadcasts, primarily pamphlets, broadsheets, and ballads, represent a crucial transitional phase, marking a shift from purely oral or manuscript-based news to more widespread, if still limited, forms of dissemination. They were vibrant, colorful, and often sensational, providing glimpses into the burgeoning desire for public information. Imagine the bustling streets of a 15th century city. Suddenly, a hawker appears clutching a stack of freshly printed sheets. These are broadsheets or broadsides, single sheets of paper printed on one side, often adorned with woodcut illustrations. They were the tabloids of their day, focusing on sensational news, major battles, scandalous executions, monstrous births, or dramatic natural disasters. A broadsheet might vividly describe a comet sighting, interpreted as a divine omen, or recount the gruesome details of a public hanging. They were cheap to produce, compared to books, and designed for quick consumption, read out loud in public squares or tacked to church doors. Their visual elements made them accessible even to the illiterate, providing a powerful narrative through imagery. Pamphlets were slightly more substantial, typically small, unbound booklets of a few pages. They could delve deeper into a specific event or controversy. Political pamphlets might argue for or against a particular claimant to a throne, or detail a ruler's new policies. Religious pamphlets often articulated dissenting theological viewpoints, particularly as the Reformation approached. Imagine a pamphlet circulating through a town, detailing the grievances of peasants against their lord, or advocating for a new religious doctrine. While still limited in circulation compared to later centuries, their relative affordability and ease of production meant they could reach a wider, though still primarily urban and literate, audience than ever before. Alongside these printed forms, ballads served as a dynamic and widely accessible form of sung news. Wandering minstrels, street performers, and even ordinary people would compose and perform songs about current events. These could be heroic tales of battles and kings, tragic narratives of love and loss, or satirical jabs at corrupt officials. Imagine a crowd gathering around a singer in a tavern, listening intently to a new ballad recounting a recent victory in battle or mourning the death of a beloved monarch. The catchy melodies and rhyming verses made the information easily memorable and highly transmittable, ensuring the news spread far beyond the reach of printed materials. These early forms of news media were characterized by their often highly biased and sensational nature. Objectivity, as we understand it, was not a primary concern. Instead, these publications and performances aimed to entertain, persuade, or provoke a reaction. Authors often had political or religious agendas, and their narratives reflected these biases. Illustrations on broadsheets were often crude but impactful, designed to elicit strong emotional responses. The rise of these media reflected a nascent public sphere, a growing hunger for information beyond the immediate confines of the village or town. While literacy remained a barrier, the public reading of broadsheets and the performance of ballads meant that even the illiterate could partake in the consumption of current events. This was a significant departure from the more controlled and localized information environment of earlier medieval times. These early news media, therefore, represent a crucial step towards the mass communication of information. They highlight a period of transition where the slow, painstaking methods of medieval communication began to give way to faster, though still limited, means of spreading news. They demonstrate a budding public appetite for information, a hint of the too much information deluge that would one day arrive, but for now, still a vibrant and social endeavor to keep abreast of a changing world.
Lessons for today: medieval information overload and our modern world. We live in an age of unprecedented information. From the constant ping of notifications to the endless scroll of news feeds, we are awash in a digital ocean of data, often feeling the immense burden of too much information. But as we've journeyed through the medieval landscape, we've seen that humanity struggles with knowledge. Its scarcity, its biases, and its management are not entirely new. Drawing connections between medieval challenges and our own digital age struggles offers a calming, hopeful perspective on our shared human experience. Consider the medieval reliance on oral tradition. In a world without widespread literacy, memory and storytelling were paramount. Information was deeply personal, communal, and often imbued with meaning through direct human connection. Today, while we have instant access to facts, we often lament a loss of deeper understanding, a sense of being disconnected from the narratives that shape our lives. Perhaps the medieval emphasis on shared stories and mnemonic devices reminds us of the power of structured, memorable information rather than fleeting data. The scarcity of written knowledge in the Middle Ages led to an intense appreciation for every manuscript, every carefully copied word. Monks labored for years to produce a single book, making it an invaluable treasure. Contrast this with our current age where information is often seen as disposable, consumed and discarded in an instant. The medieval reverence for the written word might inspire us to be more discerning, to value quality over quantity, and to truly engage with the information we consume rather than passively scroll through it. The gatekeepers of medieval information, scribes, the church, and town criers, determined what knowledge was created, preserved, and disseminated. This led to forms of censorship and controlled narratives. In our modern world, while the gatekeepers are different, algorithms, social media platforms, mainstream media outlets, the challenge of discerning truth from bias and identifying manipulated information remains profoundly relevant. The medieval experience reminds us that skepticism and critical thinking are timeless tools, essential for navigating any information environment, whether sparse or abundant. Even the medieval experience of too much news, though different in scale, resonates. The terror of a sudden plague rumor or the anxiety of distant warfare highlights the profound human impact of distressing information, even when delivered slowly. Our current struggles with mental well-being in the face of constant, often negative news streams share this ancient root. Perhaps we can learn from medieval communities' reliance on communal support and spiritual solace in coping with overwhelming information, finding ways to foster resilience and human connection amidst our own digital anxieties. The slow, painstaking process of communication in medieval times, the arduous journeys of messengers, the laborious copying of books, forced a certain patience and deliberation. Decisions were not made in haste based on instant, unverified reports. This stands in stark contrast to our rapid-fire news cycles, which often incentivize immediate reaction over thoughtful consideration. The medieval pace, while inefficient by modern standards, might offer a lesson in slowing down, reflecting, and allowing information to truly sink in before reacting. Ultimately, the medieval past, far from being simply boring history, offers profound insights into the enduring human relationship with knowledge. It reminds us that whether information is scarce or superabundant, the challenges of finding truth, preserving wisdom, and managing its impact on our minds and societies remain constant. We can learn from their reverence for knowledge, their ingenuity in sharing it, and their resilience in facing its darker sides. By looking back, we can gain a clearer perspective on our present, perhaps finding ways to navigate our own too much information world with a touch more wisdom, patience, and discernment.